Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be back here, and it's been 6 weeks. I hope you've missed us, and it's time to renew your relationship with us, and I hope you're going to do that with gusto and pull a lot of more people into our universe and our landscape. Most of you here are old members, and so we don't really need to reiterate the idea of algebra, but just since this is the start of a new season, I'd like to do that, and to remind ourselves that this really was a space for conversation, for encountering worlds that we don't normally encounter, and also to confront some of the prejudices that we bear and test those ideas, challenge ourselves and our friends' ideas from those you hear of on stage. And we've also always looked for people who've pushed boundaries, who've been controversial, who are not the rule keepers, but the rule breakers. And in that sense, it's really wonderful to be starting the season with the subject matter being a woman who really not only broke rules, but made rules and pretty much recast the nature of our country as we exist today. Somebody, when we were reaching out to all of you about the program, one of our members laughed and said, double bill on Indira Gandhi, why are you doing more than even Sonia Gandhi has done on the centenary? And I laughed and I said, well, this is not so much a celebration of a leader as an exploration of us and ourselves as a nation. Because Mrs. Gandhi pretty much embodied the best and the worst of what we could be as Indians. There is much that we can understand about ourselves and the polity we are today by looking at her life and understanding the motivations that drove it. As I said, she was the best and the worst of us. There is much that can be laid on her table. She pretty much emasculated Indian democracy, not just with the emergency, but by neutering the party internally, by destroying institutions, by creating a personality culture, by a reliance on the family, and so much more, by dismissing elected governments. She was more an electoral democrat than a constitutional one. But there's also so much that we praise her for. She was loved for her courage, her steel. She was called Durga, the way she handled the Bangladesh war, the humanitarian crisis afterwards, the way she stood up to the world and held India's head proud, the way she backed culture. But there's one thing about her that pretty much almost nobody knows, even though she is somebody that is written about and pretty much was a living entity in all our lives. And that is that she was a prescient and compassionate, a passionate environmental lover and defender. And that is not a small thing. Today, in the background of the G20 in America pulling out of the climate talks and of the Paris commitments, it again brings back to us how this division between development and the environment is the most crucial issue of our time. And she was prescient about that. If today we have sanctuaries and forests, and if we are aware of the pollution that we exist in, it is because there was one leader who was fighting for that 50 years ago. And that is that unknown aspect of Indira Gandhi that Jairam Ramesh has focused on. And no one better than Jairam to do that. Because in many ways, Jairam came into that world of environmental concerns as a gung-ho growthwala, as he says. When he was environment minister, he was possibly brought in more to protect the development aspect of it than the environment aspect of it. But that encounter with the environment ministry changed him, not just as a political being, but as a human being. And his concerns shifted completely. In this book, he's brought a lot of primary material that has never seen the light of day, I'd say, memos to chief ministers, letters from conservationists that show Indira's passionate engagement with this issue. And that is not just a passion. As I said, it's a DNA for why we have something that we can bequeath to our children today. And before one calls him onto stage and speaks more about the significance of this, I just want to show a short film that will evoke why this conversation is so significant back 50 years ago and even today. So, ladies and gentlemen, why we have Jairam Ramesh today.
It is clear that the environmental crisis which is confronting the world will profoundly alter the future destiny of our planet. No one amongst us, whatever our status, strength or circumstance, can remain unaffected.
And to discuss why that is just so significant, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jairam Ramesh. Jairam, as I was, thank you for being here with us. You're a man who doesn't normally keep his word, but this time you have, so thank you. You ditched us once before, so it's particularly good to have you here today. You know, as I shared with the audience that you were somebody who was declared a green terrorist by your own government. You were singularly blamed for bringing down the GDP of the country. You were universally hated when you were environment minister. The conservationists thought you weren't doing enough. Your party thought you were bringing them down. Industrialists disliked you. The right-wingers hated you. But you really did transform yourself. And I'm going to come back to that part of the story of what really happened with you in the environment ministry. But before that, you know, because we are looking at the centenary assessment of Indira Gandhi, if you were to sum up for the audience, you know, the sheer significance of her engagement with the environment, what would you say, you know?
Well, she was certainly controversial, she was charismatic, she was compelling, and she was contradictory. There were many sides to Indira Gandhi's personality, and there are those who hail her, as Mr. Vajpayee did on the 16th of December 1971, as Durga. And there are those who, quite rightly, attribute the emergency of 26th of June 1975 to her. So you have these two extremes of this dominant personality. But I think behind those two extremes, there was a human being who saw herself as a naturalist. I think that's the key. It's not I who see her as a naturalist, but it's who she thought she was, as revealed in her letters and memos and her private notings and so on and so forth. And she became a naturalist from the day she was born. She grew up in politics. She matured in politics. She became a prime minister, but she retained that essential communion with nature. A lot of it had to do with the fact that she was an only child, sickly child, traveled from place to place with a mother who was suffering from tuberculosis. So there were a lot of reasons why nature played such an important role in her life. But she became, in my view, a true ecological pioneer. And I'll give you just one example of this. Today, when you have an international conference on climate change and environment, every prime minister and every president of the world wants to go there, except, of course, President Trump. But before Mr. Trump, every president and every prime minister would go to an international conference on climate change and environment. In 1972, when the world had its first UN conference on the environment in Stockholm, there was only one prime minister in the world who actually went to Stockholm. There was another prime minister who was forced to be in Stockholm because he was the prime minister of Sweden, Olof Palme. But the only prime minister who actually went to Stockholm to talk about the environment, and you saw a clip of that speech just now, was Indira Gandhi. And at a time when her own colleagues were not in tune with her, this great authoritarian, the only man in her cabinet type of a leader, she took a path which nobody was comfortable with. Protecting forests, creating sanctuaries, banning mining, banning the shooting of tigers, creating national parks. You know, so today it's fashionable to talk about the environment. But it took Indira Gandhi, the great, powerful Indira Gandhi, 6 years to prepare a law to deal with water pollution. It took her 7 years to bring in place a law to control air pollution. Both these laws, of course, today are the mainstays of our economy. So she was, in my view, the first and last Prime Minister who made the protection of the environment a part of her day-to-day political agenda. Of course, she was having political crisis. She was having economic crisis. But in the midst of all this political and economic activity, she gave pride of place to the protection of the environment, rivers, mountains, as I said, biodiversity, wildlife. And I think that's what sets her apart.
In fact, again, to bring home the significance of this, before she created the Forest Conservation Act, between 1960 and 1980, 4 million hectares of forest land in India was diverted into non-forest use. But in the years intervening from 80 to 2000, 1 million hectares of forest land was diverted. And we are still fighting those fights, but as I said, she raised the consciousness. And what comes through in Jairam's book is exactly what he's speaking about, the passion, because in the midst of insane political crises, you can see the alacrity with which she's responding to people who are drawing her attention to the rampant deforestation and poaching and killing of birds that was going on in India at that time. So Jairam, before, again, as I said, I come to contemporary India and your own experience and what you learned, would you share with our audience what created this environmental and passion for nature in India? Can you recall some of the precious things that you found in your research?
As I said, as I've already mentioned, undoubtedly the manner of her upbringing contributed to her relationship with nature. She had a mother who suffered from tuberculosis, who had to go to hill stations every 2 months. She would go to Kashmir, she would go to Shimla, she'd go to Mahabaleshwar, she'd go to Nainital, and ultimately, of course, she went to Switzerland. And that's where Indira Gandhi did some of her initial education. So the manner of her upbringing was certainly her peripatetic existence around hill stations created this fondness for nature. Also in Indian families, in all our families, the mother's brother occupies a special place. The maternal uncle has always a special place in any Indian family. And in her case, her mother's younger brother was a botanist, was a herpetologist, and he inculcated a love for plants and forests and animals in her very early on. And I think the fact that when she was in prison in 42 to 43, she discovers Salim Ali, the famous ornithologist, the man who created the Bombay Natural History Society and gave it an international status. And Salim Ali really evokes in her an interest in birds. And she then she's one of the founder members of the Delhi Bird Watching Society, and she spends a lot of time watching birds in the 40s and 50s. And so, and also I shouldn't forget, very important, she studied in Shantiniketan, and she was under the influence of Tagore. And Shantiniketan, to those of you who may have known Shantiniketan, is a university of nature. There are no classrooms, no brick and mortar at that time. They were all under the trees. You studied under the trees, you studied nature, you studied gardening, you studied music, you studied the fine arts. So I think, her life was a life that prepared her to be somebody very conscious of the fact that nature needs to be protected. And I think this explains why, as Prime Minister, she took very unpopular decisions that were often not acceptable to her own party colleagues. And that's, I think, a tribute to her resilience on this field.
So again, we'll come to some of the battles that she fought on our behalf, and that idea that you're really preserving something for generations to come. But are you also missing out on Nehru and
No, not just generations to come, but protecting it for ourselves. I mean, we are all for ourselves. We think of the future generations later. But in all her writings, private writings and so on, she stresses the future generations less, and she stresses the present generation more. For our own health, for our own peace of mind, for our own public health, we need to protect the air, the water, and our natural resources. Nehru was an important source of influence on her. They exchanged 550 letters, father and daughter, over a 25-year period. They wrote 550 letters to each other. 10 years Nehru was in jail, so they kept writing to each other. And half these letters were from the daughter to the father. And most of these letters have to do with nature. Most of them have to do with birds, have to do with animals, have to do with forests, and have to do with mountains. Because, the British incarcerated Nehru in places like Nainital, Almora, and all these places. So it created a sort of a ambience of fondness for nature and mountains. So Nehru was an important influence. However, I think in this matter, Indira Gandhi went far ahead of Nehru. Nehru's era was a time when large dams were built, factories were set up, large-scale displacement took place, all in the name of development, all in the name of creating infrastructure. But during Mrs. Gandhi's time, I think she recognized the dangers of giganticism. The Tehri project, for instance, she never gave the green signal for that. A large number of hydel projects in Maharashtra and Chhattisgarh, she didn't give the green signal. And of course, the most famous intervention of hers was to protect Silent Valley in Kerala, where all the political parties, including her own party, wanted this hydel project in the middle of a rainforest. And she took 3 years to decide. And finally, she said, I want to protect the environment, I want to protect the rainforest, because if I don't protect the rainforest, climate will be affected. Remember, today we are all talking of climate change, but this is 1983, when climate change had not become part of the popular discourse.
When you were talking about Nehru, one of the things that struck me in the book, and it's a lovely anecdote, was, of course, that amongst the first books that Nehru gifted her was a book of birds and a book on bees and a book on insects, which was amongst her most favorite books. And the exchange that Jairam is talking about the letters between father and daughter, is that she can hear sounds of birds from the jail, but she can't see the bird. And she's writing to Nehru and saying, this is the sound the bird makes, and I saw the hint of a tail, and what do you think that bird can be? And Nehru writes back with exasperation saying, I'm glad you think so highly of me, but it's hard for me to identify the bird with a description of the tail. But a lot of their conversation, and it's really one of the most endearing things, again, an unknown aspect of these public figures that we think we know so well. And it's...
See, I think the reason why this aspect is important is because she made this private passion into a public calling. If it had remained a private passion, it wouldn't have mattered. It would have, each of us has some private passion or the other. But she made this particular private passion a matter of public policy. She converted her private obsession with nature protection into a priority for the government. And that's, I think, the real significance. The fact that Indira Gandhi was a naturalist is not significant in itself. What is significant is the fact that Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister, decided to give pride of place to nature and environment amidst all her political and economic challenges.
And just because the Siberian cranes are showing just a little while back on the screen, if you would share that anecdote that she took this diplomacy even into Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Well, one of the most revealing things that I discovered while, by the way, I must say one thing, that many people write biographies of our political leaders, but they don't rely on primary archival material. They rely on oral history or oral recollections, which are notoriously unreliable. The tradition of written archival history in our country, particularly as far as political biographies are concerned, is very, very thin. So in this book, I have not interviewed anybody, I have not spoken to anybody, I have not referred to any previous biography. It's all Mrs. Gandhi's own writings. What letters she wrote, the memos that she wrote, the files that she made her notings on, the speeches that she drafted, the messages that she sent, which mercifully were all available in the National Archives. And one of the things that I discovered was remarkable, which I also didn't know, that in 1983, in March of 1983, the non-aligned summit is taking place in India. And she's very worried about the Siberian cranes, because the Siberian cranes come every winter from Siberia to Bharatpur. And once the winter is over, they go back to Siberia. But it's very interesting. Siberian cranes, very intelligent species. While coming to India, they come via China. While going back to Siberia, they go via Pakistan and Afghanistan. And Salim Ali and others told her that the number of Siberian cranes coming is dramatically falling. And the reason why it is falling is because after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, every Afghan had this little Stinger missile, and they were, instead of shooting, they were shooting each other, but they were also shooting the Siberian cranes. So the Siberian cranes were being massacred on their return journey, and intelligent species that they are, the next year, the migration dropped because they knew that they're not going to get back. So Mrs. Gandhi, who had been sensitized to this by Salim Ali and a couple of others, decided to write a letter to the president of Pakistan, Zia-ul Haq, and the prime minister of Afghanistan, saying, what are you doing about these Siberian cranes? We have a serious problem. And, the problem is being created by the lack of security for the Siberian cranes on the return journey home. And she had a friend who now lives, she's still alive, she's 88 years old, a British woman called Anne Wright, who's a daughter of an ICS officer. She settled down in India, a great naturalist, tiger lover. And she wrote a letter to Anne Wright saying that, dear Anne, I've written to the president of Pakistan and the prime minister of Afghanistan to create safe zones for the Siberian cranes to go back, but I have no hope. I'm sure they're not going to reply to me. 4 days later, she writes back to Anne Wright saying, surprise, President of Pakistan and Prime Minister of Afghanistan both have replied. And those letters, are there in the book. And they have promised that they would create these safe zones, and so on and so forth. So, this I found, here's a non-aligned summit taking place. Fidel Castro is hugging her. And, this whole, they're talking of disarmament. They're talking of nuclear warfare. And the Prime Minister of India is talking about Siberian cranes. I just found this something, completely non-political, so to speak. And there are examples like this. September of 1971, we are about to go to war with Pakistan, and she spends 6 hours with Billy Arjun Singh, Salim Ali, various naturalists, and says, look, I'm getting sick and tired about getting complaints about wildlife being decimated in India. We need a new law. And let's have a wildlife protection law for India. And that's when the process of drafting the Wildlife Protection Act starts. And in 1972, we get the Wildlife Protection Act, which still, by the way, the act is in force. Unfortunately, it's not always enforced, like in the case of black bucks, people who go and kill black bucks and they get freed. But the fact is that today, the Wildlife Protection Act that we have is direct consequence of that meeting that took place on the 10th of September 1971. So this is what, look, I'm not a hagiographer of Indira Gandhi, okay? I didn't set out to say that she had no faults, that she made no errors of judgment, she had no errors of action, and in fact, I've discussed that quite freely. But I did find this aspect of her personality most intriguing and most puzzling. And I would have let it be had it not been for the fact that today, the 4 laws that govern the protection of the environment, the Wildlife Protection Act, the Water Pollution Control Act, the Air Pollution Control Act, and the Forest Conservation Act, all 4 acts were her legacies. And we have not, nobody has done anything to tamper with them as yet. And this was done 40 years ago.
So just a couple more facts about her before we move on to your own tenure and the immediacy of these concerns, Jairam. One was that, of course, she was the first Environment Minister of India as well, because she created the Environment Ministry.
She created the Ministry of Environment, and she was Minister for Environment for 4 years, till the day she, in fact, very interesting, 3 days before she is killed, she tells her aide that she wants to go to Srinagar. But the governor of J&K, Jagmohan, says, don't come now, the political situation is not conducive to your visit. But then she tells her friend and her colleagues that I've been going to Kashmir since 1934, but I have never seen the chinar change its color. And the best time to see the chinar change its color is October. And I want to go. And she goes to Kashmir, she goes to Srinagar to see the chinar change its color on the 28th of October, 1984. And then she goes to Dachigam, which was her favorite sanctuary. And she comes back, and then, of course, she's killed 3 days later. The last thing that she writes, the last written piece of paper that I could discover in the archives, was a foreword to a book that she writes on how to make environment politically important, how to increase the political awareness of the environmental issue. This is a foreword she writes to a book produced by one of her colleagues. So, till the end, she was, of course, political issues, Punjab, Assam, and so on and so forth. But in my view, nature remained, she was born in nature, and I think she remained with nature even on the day that she was killed.
So, as I said, let's move on to, contemporary India. Just again,
By the way, this image is beautiful because, can we go back to the previous image? Can we do a rewind? Because, this, we associate Indira Gandhi with tigers and, mega species. She was besotted with this. She was besotted with the black buck. And in 1974, she told Karan Singh, who was then the chairman of the Indian Board on Wildlife, why don't we have black buck sanctuaries in India? And the first black buck sanctuaries, Tal Chapar in Rajasthan, Rani Bennur Black Buck Sanctuary in Karnataka were created. So it's not just tigers and lions and these magnificent species that she was fascinated with, but even black bucks. And one of the last things that she does before she is killed is to take steps to protect the pygmy hog. The pygmy hog, those of you who may be from Assam, this pygmy hog is one of the smallest of the species. It's found largely in Assam, and it was becoming endangered, soon to become extinct. And she actually took very major steps, like she did for the tiger, on the case of the pygmy hog. But this black buck, has been in the news for the wrong reasons in the last few years, but is a very important part of Indira Gandhi's story as an environmentalist.
So again, just to reinforce that contrast, that even while she was the great dictator and she was somebody so feared by her own partymen, it's two aspects of Jairam's research is fascinating, is that one, conservators had complete and direct access to her all the time. They could write to her in the middle of massive political crisis.
This is another species that was going extinct. This is the gharial. And this was going extinct. And in 1975, she starts a program for the conservation of crocodiles. The crocodiles, the mugger, and the gharials. And today, this is no longer classified as an extinct or an endangered species.
And so, as I was saying, she had, conservationists had complete access to her. And the other fascinating aspect is that she's consistently writing to chief ministers, asking them to protect the environment in their states.
And she's being consistently ignored by the chief ministers.
Yes, rejected.
This great dictatorial, authoritarian, all-pervasive, omnipotent Indira Gandhi, chief ministers are thumbing their nose at her. She writes letter after letter to the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, saying, stop the Back Bay reclamation project and invest in building a new Bombay. But the Chief Minister of Maharashtra knows his priorities. He keeps writing to her, saying, I'll listen to you, madam. Very good points you have made. I'll come and explain to you. But he does precisely what he wants, which is to build Back Bay reclamation. She writes letters to the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh to stop the shooting of tigers. People forget, you could shoot tigers in India till 1970. It was banned only in 1970. The Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh said, I have already given permits to foreign tour operators. She said, cancel those permits. And Mr. Shama Shukla took 2 years to fall in line. The Dudhwa sanctuary, Mr. Bahuguna. Arjun Singh wanted to convert the Bastar Sal forest into eucalyptus. So, she was no doubt very decisive, and she was no doubt quite peremptory when dealing with her chief ministers. She made and unmade chief ministers. But on this issue, I think she chose the path of persuasion. She chose the path of, cajoling, convincing, rather than putting a gun on the head of the chief minister and saying, foreign line, otherwise you lose your job tomorrow.
So, that's a great entry point to come to you, Jairam, because when you took the seat as environment minister, you, as I was saying earlier, ended up being one of the most disliked ministers in the government from all sides. So before we get into that, can you talk about your own transformation? Who were you when you came into the environment ministry, and how did this encounter with this ministry change you, both politically, in terms of your consciousness, and as a human being?
Well, when I was asked to be the Minister for Environment on the 29th of May, 2009, I was shocked. I was shocked, and I was taken aback, and I was deeply disappointed. Because in the pecking order, environment is at the bottom of the food chain. It's finance, coal, power, commerce, industry. And for 25 years, I had spent my time doing power, finance, planning, commerce, industry. And suddenly I'm asked to go to this, godforsaken ministry, environment and forests. So I was a bit disappointed, actually. And I thought this was a sort of a demotion of sorts, because I had been in commerce and power the previous 4 or 5 years. So it took me about 48 to 72 hours to get a grip on myself and said, okay, I'm here, and let me see what I can do. And once I got into the job, and then I discovered the challenges that we face, not just in wildlife, not just in terms of forest conservation or pollution, but also in new areas like the introduction of genetically modified crops and so on and so forth. I realized that this was a huge challenge. And from being somebody who believed in growth at all costs, I, over a period of time, became somebody who said, okay, we need high growth, but can we do this while protecting our natural resources? Can we do this without necessarily leading to large-scale deforestation or large-scale pollution? And that, of course, put me on a collision course with many of my colleagues, because it means stopping projects, mining projects. It meant saying no, that you can't do certain things. I had to face the consequences sooner rather than later. But it is in that period that I really discovered Indira Gandhi, the naturalist. Because, when I went around, I went to different places, the old-timers would just say, there was a prime minister once upon a time who did all these things. And that's when I discovered, and when I read more, delved into the literature more, the files more, I discovered the battles that she fought and the struggles that she had to go through to bring about an awareness of these issues back in the 70s.
But Jairam, as much as she had to struggle, even today, especially amongst privileged Indians, the environment is still seen as a very ancillary conversation. It's seen as something that obstructs growth rather than being a handmaiden to growth. Can you talk about how your own thinking on this evolved, and why it's an economic necessity rather than a luxury?
But there are more people today than in the 70s who are conscious of the environment. There are more social activists today. There are more people's movements today. The media is more sensitive today. The international discourse is also changed in the last 40 years. So people are, they are concerned about the environment. Most of all, people are concerned about the quality of air that you breathe and the quality of water that you drink. So pollution, contamination, environment is becoming a public health concern, and people are getting concerned and worried. But push comes to shove. Push comes to shove. When you are in power, a political leader will always choose a mining project, will always choose a hydroelectric project, will always choose a railway line, will always choose a housing complex over protecting the environment. I mean, that's the unfortunate reality. Because in the political discourse, creating jobs, bringing in new investment, showing visible symbols of progress. I mean, we are in Gurgaon or Gurugram. Gurugram symbolizes India's economic advance. It also symbolizes India's ecological retrogression. I mean, both sides. There's both. I believe the thing could have been done much better. And when I was minister, I tried. But I know I was up against huge vested interests who were not willing to protect wetlands. I mean, I remember Anjali Ila Menon once, she and her husband came to see me about some wetland that was going to be damaged because of a highway that was being built. And I tried my best to convince my own colleagues. Mr. Huda was then the chief minister. But they were hell-bent on building this highway because that's where the politics was. That's
the money
where
was.
The
Let's
visible
be
was.
honest, in algebra, it's honesty.
No. I think one can be cynical and say that okay, but I don't see that. I see ultimately when you go out, you will be, people think that they are going to be judged not by the forests that they protect, but by the number of factories that they set up. They will be judged not by the number of tigers that you have saved, but by the number of 6-lane highways or the number of broad gauge railway lines that you have set up. I think there's a mindset, And I think, I can't blame them. I can't blame them. But I think the lesson I learned from Indira Gandhi was that at some point of time, you've got to have the courage to say no. In retrospect, I should have been less frequent in my saying no. I think I said no somewhat rather frequently.
Actually, only said it 6 times.
No, I said more than 6 times. I said it more than 6 times.
You had a reputation for being a brown minister, which is the great irony.
I said more than 6 times. And in retrospect, if I had been calibrated, I maybe would have survived.
I'm going to come to your dismissal, but before that, is there...
Not dismissal. I went from being a minister of a ministry with a 2,000 crore budget to a ministry with a 100,000 crore budget. So nobody in his right mind would call that a dismissal. It was an elevation.
Well, Jairam, is it part of the problem that even today, when you're enunciating this, it seems to be that you're protecting forests or animals as something that is separate from the self-interest of us as human beings? So is the economic aspect of the environment still not part of our conversation?
No,
I'd like to say that, as I said, you were blamed for bringing down the GDP. Is that something that you would accept, or is it just that our understanding of the GDP needs to change?
I think that's a completely bogus, because as the numbers show, that GDP didn't come down by 2.5 percentage points at all. No, I think, the pink press and the people who control the pink press, namely big corporate barons, were badly affected. I mean, many of these guys, one very influential industrialist was going to have a coal mine in the middle of the Tadoba Tiger Reserve, which I said no. Bombay International Airport was going to, the new Navi Mumbai Airport, was going to destroy hundreds of thousands of hectares of mangroves. And I said, you can't locate it here. You find another location. And if you want to do it here, you find a way of protecting the mangroves. So all these threatened vested interests at that point of time. And I think, this great desire to be, we must be on this 8% growth path today. We don't have to, let's grow for 25 years and let's worry about the consequences of the growth 25 years from now. What I call the grow now, pay later model is deeply ingrained in all of us. And if you talk of the environment, you're seen to be anti-growth. You're seen to be anti-progress. And I think that's really an outmoded concept. Because if India were to follow the American model, or the Chinese or the Brazilian model, we are in for hugely troubled times. So we have to find a way of sustaining an 8% growth, at the same time protecting the forests and protecting our natural resources. And I think it's possible to do that.
In fact, a fact that is often overlooked is that nature, particularly in India, provides massive employment to people. In fact, is a greater employer than industry is. And
no doubt. I mean, 250 million people in this country depend on our forests for their livelihoods. Fuel wood, fodder, small timber. And I think, one of the things that there's a letter, Swami Chidananda, who's president of the Divine Life Society, wrote a letter to Mrs. Gandhi in 1981 saying that the Himalayas are being destroyed and you must do something about the Himalayas. So Indira Gandhi writes back saying, yes, I share your concerns, I'm doing my best, but people don't listen to me. And then she was fond of quoting from the Vedas and the Upanishads and so on and so forth. Incidentally, that's one of the reasons why the RSS is deeply ambivalent on Indira Gandhi. They're completely anti-Nehru, but when it comes to Indira Gandhi, they accept her. One of the things, and one of the reasons for that is, every speech of hers, she quoted from the Atharva Veda, she would quote from the Rig Veda, she'd quote from the Aranyaka Upanishad. And she always kept telling people, if you read her throughout the 70s and 80s, she would tell people that protecting nature is not alien to Indian culture. It's part of Indian tradition. That the conquest of nature is Western civilization. Living with nature is Indian civilization. She kept saying this all the time. And she quotes in that letter to Swami Chidananda, a beautiful line, which I then made at the entrance of the Ministry of Environment and Forests. Nature protects those who protect it. Of course, in English, it doesn't sound half as good. In Sanskrit, it sounds poetic. Prakriti rakshati rakshataha. That's what she wrote in the letter. Prakriti rakshati rakshataha. Nature protects those who protect it. What happened in 2004 in the tsunami? You had destroyed all the mangroves and nature hit back at you with a vengeance. What happened in Uttarakhand in 2013? In Kedarnath and Badrinath, and we are still unearthing dead bodies. It was nature's revenge on indiscriminate road construction and infrastructure creation in ecologically fragile zones. So nature, it responds. It responds in a devastating way. And I think one of the things which I found most interesting about Indira Gandhi is how she always spoke about Indian culture. Her favorite line was, as our ancients said. As our ancients said. हमारे पूर्वजों ने कहा था, उपनिषद में लिखा था, वेदों में लिखा था. This is how she tried to communicate to people. And I think there's a profound truth in this. That one small episode, interesting episode. Mount Everest was Hillary and Tenzing climbed Mount Everest 29th of May 1953. And a journalist from Reuters goes to Mr. Nehru in Tinmurti and tells Mr. Nehru, Mr. Prime Minister, what do you have to say about the fact that Mount Everest has finally been conquered? So Mr. Nehru gets very angry. Nehru was a very short-tempered man. He lost his temper very easily. He got very angry with this journalist, Peter Jackson. And he tells Peter Jackson, Mr. Jackson, Mount Everest can never be conquered. Hillary and Tenzing have only climbed Mount Everest. And Indira Gandhi uses this in her Stockholm speech to tell the world, don't give us advice on how to protect the environment, because this comes naturally to us. Unfortunately, that message in the last 25, 30 years, we are losing.
So, we're going to run out of time very quickly. I just want to come to Mr. Modi and his dispensation. You know, how would you assess Mr. Modi's government in relation to the environment? And of course, I haven't finished grilling you on the other legacies of Indira Gandhi and how you relate to it. And so before coming to Mr. Modi, let me grill you just a little bit first.
That you talk to Sagarika about, because that's not what I set
I know,
out to
you
do.
didn't focus on that, but there's still one
do.
line in your book that gives me an entry into the Congress culture, which is that otherwise, in a book which is very factual, and as you said, you haven't spoken to people, but in your little introductions to the phase that Indira Gandhi was in, you, at the end, speak of her as a very decisive leader, and you said some of the decisions she made were magnificent, and the others did injustice to her. And Jairam, let me put it to you that that is kind of symptomatic of the culture of sycophancy and subservience in the Congress. Why injustice to her, not injustice to the country, not injustice to us?
You're tearing that statement out of context. See, I am not a defender of the emergency at all. I think it was a colossal mistake. It was a colossal error of judgment. However, as a student of political history, I can understand the political and the economic context in which the emergency took place. This is not to justify the emergency. But as students and scholars, you have to understand why decisions were taken. Some decisions that were right and some decisions that were wrong. The emergency cannot be justified under any circumstances. However, there were a set of factors that led to the emergency. Those factors, some were created by Indira Gandhi herself, and some were circumstances that were well beyond her control. And I think, we need, historians particularly, need to go beyond binaries. And in this, the Chinese are supremely pragmatic. In 1984, the Chinese Communist Party passes a resolution that Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong. Supremely pragmatic. Well, I can't see the Congress Party, I can't see the BJP, I can't see any regional party, DMK, Akali Dal, passing a resolution that our political leader was 70% wrong and 30% right.
Well, let me put another question to you, Jairam. Is it that, would you accept that Rahul Gandhi is 100% wrong for the Congress right now?
Now you asked me about, you asked me about Mr. Modi and you have jumped to Mr. Rahul Gandhi.
Well,
sticking to the serious question that you have asked.
This is the most serious question.
In the last, I think Mr. Modi's environmental policy is reflective of a certain mindset that looks at environment as a regulatory burden that is imposed and not as an obligation that you have to take on. So hence the discourse is the ease of doing business. The discourse is, let's cut the regulations so that you can move faster, get clearances faster. The Minister for Environment, the job of the Minister for Environment is not to clear projects. The job of the Minister of Environment is to protect the environment. And it's the job of the Prime Minister, of course, to give the broader direction to his or her government. So I find in the last 3 years an effort being made to loosen the regulatory structure for environment. The National Green Tribunal, for example, has been completely emasculated. Some of the forest conservation laws, they are being sought to be liberalized. The coastal zone regulation has been changed. But one thing Mr. Modi has certainly done, that he has brought a great aggression and ambition to our solar energy program. No doubt about that. But protecting the environment is more than putting solar panels across the country. I think there is more to protecting the environment than this.
But, in your tenure and during the Congress tenure, there was a lot of people's movements, a lot of objections to projects and, even on the ground, not just coming from environmentalists, but people on the ground being affected by projects. In Mr. Modi's regime, there seems to be no protests and resistance
They've all
at
been
all.
silenced. They've all been silenced. I asked my friend Sunita Narayan, who would issue a statement every day when we were in power. What have you done why have you gone underground in the last 3 years? The voice of civil society has been muzzled. And I think the voice of environmental protesters, particularly, has been muzzled. The media rarely raises environmental questions. That's, as I said, it's a mindset. It's a mindset that looks at environment as some sort of a burden. Let's not worry too much about the environment now. Let's get our growth equation right for the next 20 years, and let's worry about the environment 20 years later. That's the mindset.
So which projects, okay, we ran out of time. Just one quick question. Which projects do you most regret clearing while you were Environment Minister?
Clearing?
Yeah.
No, I think I don't regret having cleared any project. I don't regret having stopped any project. I think I did the job that was given to me in a transparent manner, in an open manner, in an accountable manner. And it hurt some people. By the way, you started off this interaction by saying that I was universally disliked. No, I was not universally disliked. I was disliked amongst large sections of corporate India. I was disliked among large sections of the scientific community. But I was not disliked in civil society. I was not disliked in tribal areas of India. I was not disliked by in the farming community of India. So yes, I was disliked in the pink press, no doubt about that. And I was disliked in certain influential media circles. But not universal is a bit of an exaggeration, Shoma.
I'm glad to see congressmen speaking up for something, Jairam. It's good to see energy somewhere. But
no, do I regret anything? No, I don't regret anything. But there are some projects which perhaps we could have taken a little more time on. And the nuclear project, that's one very important, one very clear example. The environmental clearance that was given to our nuclear power project in Maharashtra, 6 months after that clearance was given, we had Fukushima. And had that project come after Fukushima, I may have taken a little more time, and we can never if Fukushima can happen in Japan, it certainly can happen in India. So yeah, there are certain projects one could have been a little careful about.
So I'm going to open this up to the audience. And before doing that, just one last question. You said about civil society being silenced. Would you accept that entire impulse to silence civil society really started with the Congress government, the whole crackdown on FCRA?
There were sections of the Congress government who were deeply suspicious, uncomfortable, and ambivalent of civil society. But the difference between the Congress government and this government is there were doors open in a Congress regime to people who needed to be heard. Medha Patkar could be heard in a Congress government, even though she was hated. But in this government, she can't even get an appointment to see the lowest functionary. So that's the difference. I think the difference is that how do you respond to people's movements? How do you respond to what protesters are saying? Land acquisition, another big issue in India, land acquisition. There also, we listened to a lot of people. We created a new land acquisition law. That land acquisition law is being sought to be changed. And the voices of protest are sought to be silenced. That's the essential difference.
Unfortunately, wisdom comes on hindsight. We had Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia here as a guest, and I put it to him that was the Manmohan's faction wrong to be so against the Sonia Gandhi Jairam faction in terms of civil society? And he actually said that, yes, we were wrong. And I asked him to rate his own government and on economic policy. And he said, I think we did okay on growth. We were 6 or 7% and et cetera. He rated, but when it came to inclusion and to sustainability, he rated your government at 2 or 3%, you know. But that's, as I said, wisdom and hindsight. Let me open this up to the audience and let's take questions. Yeah, there's one right at the back there.
Somewhere you spoke about 8% growth and being able to protect our future environmentally. Can you just share what goes on in your head if you had to make it happen? There's a dichotomy. We can continue 8% growth and protect our future environmentally. What would you do?
Well, you know, we don't have time to get into this. Maybe I can come back on another occasion. But one factor that most of us do not keep in our minds when we talk about sustainability is the fact that today we are 1.25 billion people, and it is our karma to add another 400 million people in the next 35 years. Whatever we do, even if India were to become a nation of brahmacharis over the next 5 years, we were still going to add 400 million people. A third of our current population is going to be added. This is going to happen at a time when most countries are either facing stable population or declining population. China's population is coming down. And the only reason why the US population and the UK population is increasing is because of immigration from South Asia. That's the only reason why they are increasing. Otherwise, without immigration, their population also will start falling. So the challenge for us, which no other country has, not China, not America, not Russia, Russia population is falling, not Europe, not East Asia, is how do you create this 8% growth which is required for jobs today, but do it in a manner that is going to ensure that these 400 million people who are going to be added between now and the next 30 years is going to have the air, the water, the natural resources that you and I take for granted. So at no point of human history has any country faced this dichotomy or this challenge, so to speak. So I think if you are going to straddle both paths, the 8% path and the sustainability path, you will necessarily at times to have to take a decision that will cry a halt to mindless expansion, mindless expansion. Mindless expansion of highways, mindless expansion of mining, mindless expansion of industrial factories. I mean, these are tough decisions, you know, and I think we have not come to grips with it, frankly. Mrs. Gandhi tried to come to grips with it, but her era was different. The 1970s was a completely different era. India was growing at 3.5 to 4%. The real challenge is how do you do this when you're growing at 8% and you want to grow at 10% for a variety of reasons? I have no simple answers. Honestly, there is no magic formula. Economics does not teach you the magic formula. This formula has to evolve from situation to situation and from project to project, from program to program. And I think this has to be part of a democratic process. If people are responding in a certain manner, governments must necessarily, whether there's Congress or BJP is immaterial, they must necessarily respond in a manner that protects the livelihoods of people. What is happening in mining, for example, when you open a forest area to a mine, the benefits of mining go to some people far away from the area where the mine is, and the people living around the mining areas do not get any benefit. That situation can no longer be sustained.
Let's take some more questions, but I'll end with one perspective question I'd like to ask you. There's a question there. Yeah, first you and then Prerna.
Okay, so thank you very much for a very candid explanation about your feelings about the environment. I just wanted to once again give you a gentle nudge to answer Shoma's request for comments on Rahul Gandhi, if possible.
I think that's a valid question. This is sudden Congress amnesia happening, you know, which is that, is Mr. Rahul Gandhi the wrong person to be de facto heading the party at this crucial moment in history?
Well, I would rather keep this discussion on Indira Gandhi, the environmentalist.
Is it any wonder you're down to 44 that you only want to discuss dead people, you know?
No, I mean, the maximum I will say is that the era in which the congressman believed that an individual has a magic wand is over.
Print.
So I'll ask, you mentioned that the 4 laws which Indira Gandhi enacted, she steered, the 4 environment laws, Wildlife Protection Act, Forest Conservation Act, etc., etc. Till today, they stand scrutiny. I mean, they're still what protects the environment. But today they are being decimated, they are being diluted, there's a move to overhaul them. So why is it that the Congress, when it was in power, the move to dilute them, the dilution has been happening over time. When it was in power,
Could you speak
and
into
now
the...
when it is in opposition, why is it that it is not preserving the legacy of one of its most powerful leaders? Why is it that it is dismantling as an opposition and as a government in power?
Why aren't you fighting the dismantling of environmental
Or her
legislation?
legacy to protect the environment?
No, we are fighting. We are hopelessly outnumbered in Parliament, in the Lok Sabha. We are fighting in the upper house. And that's why, for example, the National Green Tribunal was an act passed by Parliament. The government has not had the courage to come to Parliament to amend the National Green Tribunal Act. They brought it as part of the finance bill. And in the finance bill, that is discussed only in the Lok Sabha. The Rajya Sabha has no power. So they got it passed in the Lok Sabha because there is a brute majority. So the opposition we have consistently raised these issues, but we are not getting any traction because A, we don't have the numbers in the lower house, and the government has circumvented the upper house by, this finance bill, money bill tactic. But the opposition has a role to play. If you are asking me whether the opposition is playing its legitimate role, I think a lot is left to be desired. I mean, the opposition
Jairam,
can be certainly more aggressive than we have been in the case.
Jairam, you've had a very soft entry into algebra. Unfortunately, the chip into your entry here was environment, because I'd love to have you back to discuss politics. And before we let you go, there is a question. You said we are hopelessly outnumbered in Parliament. Can I at least ask you, what is your analysis for why you are hopelessly outnumbered?
Well, you go back to 2014, why we went from 209 to 44. I think there are a complex set of reasons. The BJP ended up getting 23% of the vote. BJP. The Congress got 20% of the vote. Mr. Modi added 8% to the BJP. And so the BJP ended up getting 31% of the vote. So suddenly, Mr. Modi was a major factor in 2014. He converted a contest between political parties into a contest between individuals. He converted it into a presidential form of a contest, no doubt about it. And full marks to Mr. Modi for a campaign that he ran. For a campaign that he ran, he was aggressive, he was communicative, he was ubiquitous, all over the place, and indefatigable energy, no doubt about it. So we, on the other hand, we had been in power for 10 years. We were burdened with this Anna Hazare, Arvind Kejriwal, all this, we had nothing but corruption. But the fact is that the Congress was 144 seats in 2004, but we ended up getting 209 seats in 2009. But something happened after 2009. And I think the corruption issue just simply overwhelmed whatever messages that we were sending out. And people were not willing to even listen to our side of the picture. And we were outgunned, we were outmaneuvered, we were out-campaigned, we were out-funded, and ultimately we ended up getting 44 seats. So the 2014 was a particularly low point.
You didn't use one word, you were out-leadered as well.
Out?
Leadered.
In 2014, yes, obviously.
Yes.
I mean, no doubt. I mean, how can we say that clearly the people of India put their faith in Mr. Modi? I mean, we can say that their faith has been misplaced, it has been exaggerated, but in 2014, at that point of time, large sections of the Indian population placed their faith in him. I don't like him, but this is the reality. I mean, we have to understand, the phenomenon of Mr. Modi, why I think he tapped into every Indian a desire for strong leadership. He tapped into every Indian a desire to hear the leader say something. As I said, he was all present.
So I'm going to end this, Jairam, because we've really run out of time, but with a question, which will be the opening question when you come back to Algebra, which is that what's the Congress game plan for revival, and why does it look so comatose 3 years later? That's the first question I'm going to pose to you when you come back.
Thank God, next time.
If everyone's even remotely up for that conversation, we should pose it now. But we'll leave it for the next session because we have our next speaker. And maybe just one other thought to leave with us. When we were discussing this about the 8% growth and the GDP and environment, we didn't have time to go into it. But perhaps the whole question is about changing the perspective and at looking at nature as an employer and not just industry as an employer. And Jairam has been speaking about how even today we really have 4.5% growth, not 8% growth as we imagine, because the ecological cost of what we are doing is so high. We just don't compute it in economical terms. And we'd really, Jairam.
The GST associated with the destruction of nature is very high, but that bill we don't understand. I mean, we're not fully appreciative of the bill that the destruction of nature puts on us. And I think that's very important.
So this is only a break in the story, Jairam. We have to have you back for a political conversation. You got the easy ride, the easy ticket this time. But thank you very much. As I said, it's one of the most significant issues, environment. We don't give it the importance it deserves. So it was good to have a man like you speaking about it. And if you can keep that flag flying higher, it'll be great. Thank you very much for being here.